I'd like to welcome Ben and Suzy, who'll be with us soon, to come and speak tonight about military, aviation and police UFO reports. So Ben's from Victoria. He's going to kick it off for us with some things that he's got interest in. So take it away, Ben.
No worries. Thank you, Sheryl, and welcome everyone tonight. It's good to see you all. I'm probably the only one in lockdown, probably. Everybody else is probably not in Victoria. So
I think Suzy is.
Oh, Suzy's in lockdown too. Yeah, that's right. So, well, we'll have our cup of tea and we'll get stuck straight into it. So, I'm from UFO Vic in Victoria, and down in Victoria there are a number of military bases, and the one that I want to focus on tonight is the East Sale RAF base, and I live about an hour away from that in the eastern part of Victoria. And the Sale RAF base has had an extraordinarily long connection to the UFO phenomenon, and it's a base that kind of goes underneath the radar for the most part too. It's not one of the big bases. It's not Amberley or Williamtown or Tyndall or any of those sort of places. It's a small base, but it's just been through a major upgrade. They've spent something like $85 million on it, and when you look at the base, you still go, wow, it's not really that big, but it's always at the center of UFO activity, and I mean that geographically as much as anything. It's basically all around where it's located in East Sale. There's a long history of UFO reports that dot the area around the Sale RAF base. And so it was originally opened as a training base on the 22nd of April in 1943. And it was on West Sale, so it wasn't even at the current location. And 3,000 air crews trained there through until the end of World War II. And they had a shocking mortality rate. They lost well over 100 pilots and trainees because the Beaufort bombers that they were using had a critical flaw in them in their rudders, and they would actually nosedive. And they've crashed all over the place. So there really was a high attrition during the war years. And after the war, the Central Flying School was relocated there in 1947. And acrobatics is what it's also really known for. That commenced in 1962 with the roulettes, and they were flying around in Mackie jets at that point in time, and now they're in the propeller PC-9s, etc. So the RAF School of Photographics was also at the East Sale base for a very long time as well. So that's interesting. The School of Photographics was located in Sale. And in 1989, 32 Squadron was relocated to Sale, originally a bomber squadron in World War II. It became a transport wing. So between training, transport, and the photographic school, it's played a sort of a relatively low-key role to date. And it really is just an incredible little base. So let's talk about the UFOs. So I can track cases going back from like 1947 through until the mid-2000s, if you like, with a high level of cases that have occurred in that area that are really good cases. They're not just simply lights in the sky. These are high strangeness cases that have peppered around that base. So in 1947, a mother and son were driving from Maffra to their home in Boisdale. And this is during the day. And as they're driving along, a glowing ball came ripping through a cornfield, and it went past straight across the road in front of them, and they nearly crashed. And this thing just came out of nowhere. That's in 1947. So this golden ball just comes straight across. In 1958, a young girl in Maffra is reported that she was abducted and taken for a ride on a UFO in 1958. In 1963, a farmer had a very famous case at Willow Grove. And Willow Grove is probably the furthest point away. That would probably be about 90 minutes from the base. And in that particular encounter, a dairy farmer was herding his cows into the shed, and this UFO came down out of the cloud deck, and it sat there, and it just rotated above him, and the cows all went crazy and pushed into the shed, and his son was in the shed. And that case got a lot of coverage back in 1963. And it was even investigated by James McDonald when he came out to Australia. fast forward to 1972, and we've got a police case where a Constable Jarvis was doing his patrol at night around Sale, and just north of Sale, there was an area called Napper's Corner, and he saw this light descend out of the sky and land in the paddock. And he decided that was a bit strange. So he drove back into town to the East Sale RAF base, and he contacted the intelligence officer and he said, "Have you got anything flying around out here tonight?" This is in 1972. They said, "No, we haven't got anything out there." So the intelligence officer hopped in the car with him and they drove back out to the area, and they saw this light coming towards them from the east, and it came over the top of the car and it stopped. And then it shone this bright beam down over the police car with the constable and the intelligence officer. And they stood there looking up. And then all of a sudden, the light took off. But the light that it left remained around the car for quite some time. The beam of light stayed where it had been. And this is just one of my favourite cases. And this is no more than about 10 minutes from the Sale RAF base. In 1972, there was a major police sighting again in Traralgon and a small town called Rosedale, just nearby. A guy was cycling on his bike at 4:45 in the morning training, and this UFO came behind him and it followed him as he was cycling back into town. And he stopped at the stockyards and said to the head stockman, "Look, there's this thing out there." And they both saw it. They both went to the Traralgon police station, and 3 on-duty police officers came out, and they all stood there and watched this UFO. And the night before that in Rosedale, which is about 15 minutes east of Traralgon, a family's horse started going crazy in the paddock, a little pony. And they went outside, and here's this diamond-shaped object in the paddock. And the little pony is running around all stressed out, and the thing's flying from corner to corner, and then it eventually takes off. This is in 1972 as well. And again, no more than half an hour from the base. So fast forward to 1980, when there was a major sighting called the Rosedale water tank incident at Kilmany, which is actually east of Rosedale. And a farmer's water tank was drained overnight by a UFO that came down and hovered on top of that water tank. And it also landed on the ground and left a trace impression on the ground. And the stock ran around crazy for weeks afterwards. They took them a long time to get the cows to calm down. And the farmer who had the experience was sick for 5 days with a radiation style illness afterwards. And his watch had stopped at 1 a.m. at the time when the UFO had appeared. And again, this is no more than 15 minutes from the Sale RAF base in 1980. And in 1981, out the back of Sale, there's a heap of lagoons out in that area there, and there's a big dairy farming community there. And one of the local farmers, Charles Dingwall, came out into his paddocks one morning in 1981, and he saw a burnt impression on the ground, and all the trees had been singed as well. And he noticed that his billabong was way empty on water for the time of the year when they had plenty of rain and plenty of water. The billabong had been drained. So you've got a water tank drainage, and you've got a billabong that's been drained with a trace landing case in 1981. So and these are only selected cases too. Like I'm just peppering cases. There's a whole host of them out there. And in 1988, there's almost a Roswell-style story attached to the Sale RAF base, where they were opening an administration building, and Kim Beazley, who was the defence minister at the time, was coming down to open this building. And so they invited the media. Still sounds like a bit of a slow news day to go film Kim Beazley opening an admin building at the RAF base, but the helicopters came from Melbourne, and the media were dropped there. They were told to wait. They weren't quite ready. And they got a bit bored, and a couple of them decided they'd wander off. So they walked off, and they came to one of the hangars in the Sale base, and the door was open. And they looked inside, and they could see the silver disc sitting in the hangar of the Sale RAF base. And there was a little office and a man in a white lab coat who was in there. And the man in the lab coat came out, and he says, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And he shooed them out of the hangar. And then the military police came and took them and took their videotape and took them away. And that's kind of a really interesting story about the RAF base. I've been to the base myself a few times, and there are some hangars there. But it's a story that I thought, how can you verify a story like that? That's a very hard story to verify. So I thought, okay, I'll verify one thing. I'll go and look at this admin building. So I went walking around the base and I came to an admin building. And sure enough, Kim Beazley had actually opened that building on the 21st of the 10th, 1988. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So the first part of that story has a basis in fact. So that's very interesting. In 2006, coming into the more modern era, a lady in Stratford, which is a little town 15 minutes north of Sale, 3 o'clock in the morning, her cat wanted to go to the toilet. So she got up to let the cat out. She looks out the window and she sees one huge carousel of lights sitting in the sky above her house. And she looks out the other window and there's another one, 2 big carousels sitting silently in the sky of lights. And that is no more than 15 minutes from the base. So the base itself has had this huge history of really good cases happening around it. And even from the actual base itself in 2002, US military were there doing training on oil rig protection. And they were doing a perimeter walk around the Sale base, these US Army guys. And as they walked around, they saw these lights come out of the sky and they came down like this and they sort of danced around each other. And then they went back up into the sky. And that was reported to MUFON by the soldiers who were involved at the Sale RAF base. So this is the stuff that you hear about, let alone the stuff that you actually don't hear about from a small little base that's really has quite a big history. And I found a document from 1960. Again, a US air crew had taken off from Sale and they were flying down over Tasmania. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, the navigator said to the pilot, there's something about 5,000 feet below us. They're at 40,000 feet. This thing's about 35,000 feet. And the pilot looked out and he saw this round sphere there. And it passed them at a phenomenal amount of speed. And they were so impressed by that they actually wrote a report on it to the wing commander Roby at the time at the East Sale RAF base. And that was in 1960. So it's fascinating when you look at what's happening around this area. And there's a whole host of other cases that are smaller than that. And even Lake Wellington, which is sort of right next to the base behind it, which is part of the Gippsland Lakes network, there's been reports of lights traveling around under the water in Lake Wellington. So over time, there's even a sign, even when you drive down to Melbourne now, there's a road sign, and it's just about near where the Rosedale water tank incident occurred. And someone's written on the back in graffiti, Area 51. on the back of a road sign. And I've been meaning to stop and take a photograph of it. But you're going past it at 100 k's an hour with 100 other cars, and it's just so hard to stop and get off the road to take a photo. Perhaps I will do that, where someone's graffitied Area 51. So, and that actually is correct. That area, that whole area of Maffra, Sale, Stratford, and north around there to the Great Dividing Range, it does have that really long history of UFOs. So I'm going to diverge from that and talk about another case that I found, which was interesting. And this is at Woomera, over when they were doing the nuclear tests. So you hear about the UFOs around nuclear silos in Russia and the United States, and well, they actually visit here in Australia as well, which is quite interesting. And this was at night on the 15th of July, 1960. So same year as the US pilots encounter just north of Launceston. So it's a little town called, or an area called Wewak, and that was the site of the Vixen A tests, and it was about 15 miles from Maralinga. And there's an array of static balloons that they have there that they use for testing instrumentation. And at 7:15, a report was received from a security constable, Scarborough, that a balloon had burnt in the air. And the balloon officer went out and he inspected the array of balloons that they had out there at Wewak. And he noticed that none were missing and that they were all intact. And Constable Scarborough had actually been sitting in his caravan, and he'd seen this light come down, and this light was swirling around and playing on and what he described as bright as moonlight, and it was playing around on the ground, which I thought was really interesting. And he left the caravan, and he saw it go larger, turn red, and then he saw it take off. And he wasn't quite sure exactly how far away it was, but he said it appeared to occupy about 1.5 to 2 degrees of the horizon. And he reckoned it burned for about 30 seconds. And there were another 4 witnesses that also saw that as well at WEWAC. And one was Trevor Hoskins, who was a technical assistant for the health physics group, Russell Kingsley, a fitter for the Department of Mines, Ian Hasgard, the supervising technician for the PMG department, which I believe is power, and a Captain Keith Ross, who was the catering officer. And they all described the same thing, seeing this light come down out of the sky. Their time varied from 2 seconds to 15 seconds, but this light came down, they all saw it, and nobody knew what it was. So it's not necessarily a big case, but it's big from the point of view of where it actually occurred. And this is around the nuclear testing facilities at the time when the British were doing their nuclear tests.
Okay, so I'm going to share with you tonight some various aviation-related and military UFO sightings from New Zealand. There's quite a lot of them on our website, so anytime you want to go to ufocuснz.org.nz, you can have a look at the list that's there. I'll start with a Bay of Plenty Waikato sighting called the Silver Sphere sightings in 1995. And this outlining this one because it was an air traffic controller who actually was one of the main witnesses to these sightings. And that was my late colleague, the late Graham Opie, who was Senior Air Traffic Controller at Hamilton International Airport at the time of this sighting in 1995. And it was because of this actual sighting that I contacted him. And we became very close friends for 20 years. And he was my right-hand man in UFOCUS NZ while he was practicing air traffic controller. So this series of sightings started on Saturday, the 25th of February, 1995, and at about 10:30 at night. And this is actually my sighting that I'm talking about here that led up to the major sighting. So I went outside my house late at night with my dog and saw 2 objects in the sky. The first one I saw was the green object that was coming down my valley. It looked to be about 40 feet wide. It was like a massive green sphere slowly drifting down the valley from the hills. And as I turned to watch it heading towards the sea, I saw the orange one here coming into view, coming out over the lowlands and heading out towards the sea. So this is roughly a map of, if I'm down here, can you see my cursor, Sheryl?
Yep.
Okay, so if I'm down here, this is Tauranga Harbour, this is an island. This green ball came down my valley out over the harbour and towards Mare Island. And this one was coming in, and you'll notice that it came down on a steep trajectory, levelled off, slowed down, and then went down again. And at the latter part of this descent, my view was blocked a bit by trees, but considering the course they were on, they were pretty much going to meet somewhere. And this whole area off Tauranga, the islands of the city of Tauranga where I live, has long been associated with sightings, and we'll go on to that in a minute. So 6 days later, a family in the nearby fishing village of Omokaroa, near where I live, were cleaning up after a barbecue, and they saw this. This is done in black and white, but this was glowing as my drawing was, and with a long glowing tail behind it, and it was actually ascending from sea level and heading out over the Kaimai Ranges behind Tauranga. So this was the second sighting of something really unusual. And the fact that it was ascending from sea level means, of course, it wasn't a meteorite. And then a few days later, on the 9th of March, off the coast of Tauranga, this here is a spit of land called Mount Maunganui and Maunganui Township that juts out in front of the harbour. So going beyond out to sea, we've got one of the islands that I showed you before, and there's a little rock here where fishermen like to sit called Pudney Rock. And it was sitting out here was a meteorologist and tugboat master from Tauranga and his friend fishing. And while they're sitting there, they heard this strange sort of a whistling noise, and overhead went a bright silver object with a short pinkish flaming tail behind it. And the silver object was reported to be surrounded, or in front of it was kind of like a halo, as if it was pushing the air forward. Now this roared horizontally overhead, and the interesting thing was it then ascended, so it rose up and over the Kaimai Ranges, heading over towards the Waikato district. So on a horizontal path, ascending over the Kaimai Ranges. So way beyond over the Kaimai Ranges was my friend and right-hand man, ATC Graham Opie, sitting in a air traffic control tower at that point of time. So approximately 2 to 3 minutes after the fisherman saw this thing go overhead at Pudney Rock, he saw it 17 kilometres south of the air traffic control centre, and he clocked it on his technology going from what he called 160 arc to 183 arc. And it did that in 1.5 seconds at 17 kilometres away. And at this time, as it passed over and continued across the Waikato district, both Hamilton and Rotorua airports were receiving dozens of calls from the public wanting to know what it was. This is a painting that's on my wall in my office that Graham did of the object. Again, there's that silver ball right out in front with a gap, and then this, this kind of sparkler kind of effect behind it. So during the 1.5 second observation from the control tower, using calculations and his ATC technology, Graham knew that the object ascended. So it ascended some 5,000 feet in the 1.5 seconds, and increased speed by some 18,000 kilometres an hour to around 50,000 kilometres an hour. Now that's phenomenal. So it was coming from Pudney Rock out here between Mare and Mortiti Islands, passed over Tauranga, passed south of Hamilton Airport, where he was here, just south of Cambridge, and all the way across here. It was sighted by hundreds of people, and in particular, a couple who were sitting at a country crossroads who reported it to Graham to the air traffic control. So using a complex calculation called triangulation, which I couldn't understand when he explained it to me, and using the times and positions from the sightings here at Hamilton, at the Tukawa Crossroad, and here towards Rotorua, from the 3 sightings, the object was at an altitude of approximately 19,000 feet, travelling some 26 kilometres at a speed of approximately 32,000 kilometres an hour. Now, it was reported in the Waikato newspaper, goodness gracious, great balls of fire, on the Friday, the following day. And of course, they went to someone they thought was an expert. So the newspaper went to Dr. Wayne Orchiston, who was the director of the Carter Observatory in Wellington, who said it would undoubtedly have been a meteorite. And even though he was provided with the information such as something similar had been cited by a number of people in the weeks beforehand, ascending and descending, exact same description, and the fact that it rose up to go over the Kaimai Ranges, he still said it was a meteorite. And in fact, down the bottom of the screen here, they finished the article nicely, talking to a lady who said that, you know, if you describe this sort of thing, people think you're nuts, which is a nice psychological little way to end their article, to put people off ever reporting something like that again. So UFOCUS NZ, we approached Dr. Frank Bateson, the late Dr. Bateson, who was a renowned New Zealand astronomer. We gave him all the information on these sightings, and he categorically said it would not have been a meteorite, but he was not willing to speculate what it could have been. And if we look at retired New Zealand airline pilot Bruce Cathy's Planetary Harmonic grid, which he has written a number of books about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but Bruce Cathy formulated a harmonic grid system that goes right around the planet, covering the entire planet. And he was actually visited in New Zealand by CIA. He was at first threatened, and then they offered him a job and said his calculations were so incredibly close to what they already knew that they really wanted to take him on board, and he turned them down. And from that point, all his books were taken off the shelves in America and got rid of. They completely disappeared. So if we look at this area here on the grid line, Tauranga sits right on the grid there. And this whole area where the islands are out here, they sit on the grid. And I've got dozens and dozens of sightings, New Zealand sightings that come from this area and extending down across Rotorua here as well. So that's an interesting connection that this has. Just what it was, we don't know. But there have been a number of sightings in New Zealand over the years of these metallic spheres. One was racing alongside a lady in a remote area who was traveling down a valley, and it was traveling along beside her car, rising up over the fences and then going back down just above ground level across the paddocks, contour flying over the humps and hollows, and then up over the fence again, and then it took off at great speed. So this actual sighting propelled Graham into greater things in the UFO field, and he ended up talking on Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, and lots of other stations around the world about his sighting and about the fact that he was now a UFO investigator. Next sighting I want to have a look at happened in 1978, and it was an Air New Zealand DC-1030. And it was about 1:30 in the morning local time. They had a near collision with a cylindrical object over the Pacific Ocean. 1978 was a time of huge UFO flap in New Zealand, and in fact worldwide. It's written about in the old Flying Saucer Review magazines. It's very well known that that year in particular was a real hotspot in history for a lot of sightings. And this sighting was made by retired Captain George Richardson, a New Zealand pilot, who flew DC-1030s and Boeing 747s from 1961 to 1991. He was very experienced with a total of approximately 18,000 flying hours. On this incident, he was co-pilot at the time, and the total duration of the incident was about 10 seconds. This is a kind of aircraft, DC-1030, that he was flying, an Air New Zealand craft. And so they were out over the Pacific on a northerly heading just north of the island of Samoa on the Auckland to Honolulu run or track, cruising along. It was very dark. He stated that it was an extremely pitch black night, and we all know what those sort of nights are like. And he described that they were skipping along over the stratiform when he sighted out to the left a bright light rapidly approaching and said to the captain, "Traffic on our left." This was completely unexpected because they did not expect to see any other aircraft in this section of the flight. And within seconds, a large cylindrical object around 150 to 200 feet long, rounded at the leading end, tapering at the rear, came into clear view. So the light was no longer visible surrounding it. It was actually the object they could see, and it crossed in front of them. It had no wings, rudder or tail, and they estimated its speed to be over 960 kilometers an hour. It had windows spaced along the side, which had harsh light coming out of them. And in those 3 to 4 seconds where it was crossing in front of them at close proximity, the pilots believed they were going to collide with it, and it was too late for any evasive action, and they believed they would die. Now, when I interviewed George about this sighting, he said it was a horrible moment. From the moment they first saw the light approaching out on the left, they knew that it was on the same level as them, same altitude as them, It was rapidly approaching. They knew that they could not turn or move their aircraft because they did not know what that light would do, whether it would also take evasive action and wipe them out, or wipe them out simply because they both stayed on the same course. They didn't know what it was until it got close enough to see the actual characteristics of the object. He said it was a terrible moment. They looked at each other, they said goodbye. It is highly significant from his description that the object left no turbulent wake at an estimated distance of only 150 feet. So we're talking about something going at a terrific speed and crossing very, very close in front of them. And he said to me that ordinarily if an aircraft, a sizable aircraft, passed in front of another aircraft, the turbulence alone would knock it out of the sky. And they, as it passed, they expected that that would be what would happen, that there was no impact, but they would be killed by the turbulence, which was likely to flip the plane, but it didn't. There wasn't even a ripple. Tahiti and Honolulu airports, they called them straight away and they confirmed that the DC-10 was the only traffic in the Pacific, so it was not an aircraft. So co-pilot Richardson and the pilot did not report the incident for fear of consequences, possible job losses, derision, etc. George told his story to UFOCUS NZ in 2007 and appeared in the New Zealand program 60 Minutes, The Truth Is Out There, which Graham and I assisted them to produce. And that is on our website. It's a rather grainy, slightly blurry version of it, but it's very interesting. And you can see George Richardson interviewed in the cockpit of his private Cessna or small light plane. He's a very interesting character, very straight up, and we've got several other sightings that he has had over the years of his flying, which he has provided us with, and they're on our website too. And at the moment, we've got in the States, the Navy, etc., have decided to formulate a formal reporting system so that their pilots can now feel free to offer their stories up. It's a real shame that there are probably thousands of pilot sightings worldwide that have not come to light. And when I lobbied the Chief of Defence in New Zealand for the release of the New Zealand files, Graham and I went through the files and found that there were over 90 pilot sightings that had not been investigated, or if they had been, the final reports were not in the files, just the memos referring to them. Next one I'd like to have a look at is October the 30th, 1969 at 3:10 in the morning. And this is at Waipukaro Aerodrome, Hawke's Bay. So we're talking about down the east coast of the North Island, sort of central North Island. And a security services officer saw what he described as a rainbow disc. This is what Waipukaro Aerodrome looks like. It's a country aerodrome, grass landing strip. It's got a couple of hangars and a clubhouse, etc. And it really hasn't changed much since 1969. But that's the kind of environment that this sighting took place in, with sheep running around on the airstrip. So here we have Mr. Cudby, who was the witness at the aerodrome. Here's his aerial view of the actual area. So this is the main road. He came in here in his ute, around in front of the hangar and the clubhouse, parked his ute there. That's his dog, his guard dog, and he was standing basically here. And a UFO came in on an angle, hovered here, not far from him, and eventually took off in this direction. So he had come in and his dog was behaving strangely. He didn't know why. He was coming to check the buildings, make sure everything was secure in the early hours of the morning. He had he was facing the windows of the clubhouse, and there were some lights reflecting in it that he was aware of. He didn't worry too much about it because he thought it might have been a farm vehicle going down the road late at night or something like that. And sometimes trains went past further over the paddocks and lit up the windows. So he didn't take too much notice until he became aware of a noise like a vacuum cleaner running, and the dog started growling and behaving very badly. He turned and saw a large object hovering about 50 feet above the ground, not far from him, and he said it was enormous. This is just a mock-up drawing of it. By the time it began to hover very close to him, the dog was now uncontrollable, and we often hear this in the UFO reports, the animals going crazy. The object had diffused light like a rainbow coming from up beneath it that became more brilliant as the motor noise increased, and he described it as beautiful, shiny like chrome with no seams or joints and clearly defined. So he got his very powerful spotlight and he ran the spotlight over it 3 times, which and was able to see quite a lot of detail at close proximity. After he'd done that, the object swayed gently while hovering. We know that as the falling leaf movement. And he shone a spotlight on it. As soon as he did that, it tilted towards him and shot up into the sky at an angle and vanished. And if we go back to this picture, we can see that on the edge of the building here, he indicates there was a windsock there. And when the UFO took off, he described the windsock as being pulled out to a horizontal position as if it was stiff in the direction of the UFO, which is unusual because the flag on it, or the windsock, wouldn't have been, is made of fabric. And once it had gone a certain distance away, the UFO, then the sock just fell to a vertical position. But first it spun madly on its axis. Okay, so this is the original drawing that was done, I think, by Brian Dickerson, actually, who helped to investigate this, or his parents did. And it's a rather unusual shape dome here. It hasn't got a clearly defined dome on the top. And at that point in time, a number of other things occurred straight after this incident. The dog went completely insane and it took him ages to catch it. The sheep were running around crashing into the fences. Mr. Cudby ended up with a 32-hour severe headache that wouldn't go away. He felt the grass soon after it had gone where the UFO had hovered. It was warm and extremely dry and crinkly compared to the very wet grass around it. And several farming families were woken at that time by what they thought was a low jet passing overhead. And they later received a report from a traveller who was going down that main road on his way to Wellington and saw a dark object moving slowly over the aerodrome just before the time of the event. So that's quite an interesting one from an area that has a lot of reports coming in from that particular area. It's an area of New Zealand, Hawke's Bay, where I had my first, some of my first sightings and contact experiences. And it was on the same highway that runs past the aerodrome where I experienced missing time at the age of 20. So moving on to this one. This is our last report, I think. January 1974, 11:30 p.m. at the RNZAF base Woodburn, Blenheim, New Zealand, a glowing barbell UFO. Now, RNZAF base Woodburn is at the top of the North Island in Blenheim, top of the South Island rather, and there's a valley very near Blenheim that is known as the Spy Base. So up that valley, there are these huge white domes, which are officially called the New Zealand International Communications Centre, but fondly known to most Kiwis as the US Spy Base, because we know that there is a lot of surveillance stuff and communications going on there. And it's interesting that around this area is also where we had the Kaikoura Lights sightings happening a few years later in 1978. And there have been a lot of unusual sightings. It also sits on one of the Bruce Cathy grid lines, Blenheim. So RNZAF officer Anthony Chatfield had been training some 60 airmen cadets And they were at their first night at the base, staying in the barracks, and he was having a lot of trouble getting these young men, young teenagers and that, to go to sleep and be quiet. So he decided to get them all out at night and get them to run around the quadrangle and get them worn out and then send them back to bed again. And it was at this time that one of the airmen pointed out to him something over the Richmond Range, which is a range of hills running between Blenheim and the city of Nelson. It was some 6 to 7 estimated kilometres away, but even at that distance, they described it as pretty big. There was no sound, mind you, they were at a distance, as it travelled in a southwest direction at an estimated 200 to 250 miles an hour. There were 2 large glowing globes that were connected by a golden bar. They watched that, all 61 of them, for about 3 minutes before it passed into cloud. He reported it to the base, and it was recorded in the incident book. And 3 months later, when he was discussing the sighting with a colleague, Officer Chatfield fetched the incident book that all duty NCOs have to fill out on completion of their tour of duty, and the page on which the sighting had been recorded had been removed, not by being ripped out or the page being torn, but it had been neatly cut. So it was deliberately removed by someone, so there was not that official record of it. So moving on from 1974, in 75, the following year, is when things started to really wind up in New Zealand. By 78 to 80, we were in full swing with a major UFO flap that includes the Gisborne UFO sightings, where there were over 200 sightings by all kinds of people. And the Kaikoura lights happened in that time also, the 2 major sightings that were captured on video and radar. So that was a very interesting time in history. So if anyone wants to go to our website, as I said, you can have a look at the military, aviation, police and astronomer sightings, which is very interesting. We're still building that. We're building a new website, so it's not yet complete, but all of those are on there for you to have a look at. There's a lot of sightings there that are from pilots and who've had whole plane loads of people sight things, but I thought I'd pull a few different ones out of the bag tonight, and you can read those other ones for yourself. I've had a lot of inquiries over the years of people wanting to continue his work and wanting to build on it and trying to get in touch with him, because he passed away several years ago, but he's left an amazing legacy, and he was better known overseas than he was in New Zealand, very sadly. Yeah. When he spoke in Auckland in 1997, he said, I'll give you a layman's speech so that you can understand. And it was really great because he simplified everything. And there's a very good documentary about an hour long of an interview with him made by an Australian interviewer, and where he talks about the CIA. I probably should get that onto our website so people can watch it. He also saw, when he was flying NACs around New Zealand, NAC aircraft, he flew over the Kaikoura Harbour north of Auckland and saw a submerged object, a USO, and the nature of this harbour is such that it would have to be something that had landed in there, because the channels were so difficult to manoeuvre through the mud banks that no UFO would even, or anything would try to get in there. It was, you know, it's bigger than a whale, and he made that sighting as well.
But anyway, I've got 3 cases that I'd like to talk about. Two are Navy cases, and the third one is of a police officer's experiences. And here's a more detail, because his report, he told us many years ago in the 90s, and actually his case was well documented because it was to go in as be part of a book manuscript, which my late husband and a couple of other people never actually got around to producing. So I'm sitting here with this manuscript and this great case. But anyway, I'll start off with the first ones, and I want to screen share here. So the first one This one actually occurred in 1962 and it involved the HMAS Voyager. But this one is where it encountered an unidentified submerged object. So for those who don't know and may not have heard about this, the HMAS Voyager was a daring-class destroyer of the Royal Australian Navy, and it was actually lost in a collision in 1964. But 2 years prior, there was an incident where it had an encounter with a USO, or an unidentified submerged object. So the witness reported this incident to Brad Mildern, who was a UFO investigator at the time, and Brad passed it on to myself and my husband at the time, Martin. And we were running the Australian Centre for UFO Studies at the time. That was back in 2004, 2004. And we reprinted the case in the journal, which we were producing, called UFO Quest. Anyway, the witness was a member of the crew on duty in the wheelhouse when Voyager chased the object. And this, let me just go back here. I've already lost my place. Can you believe it? Must be Friday night. So anyway, he was a clearance diver serving on HMAS Voyager, and the approximate location was where Voyager actually met its doom, sadly enough, was anchored at Jarvis Bay with the rest of the RAND fleet that was involved in workup trials for the oncoming Far East Strategic Reserve trip that was due to depart from Sydney in February 1962. So we're talking about down here at the base, HMAS Creswell, and it's a better shot here. This is where the ship was. Anyway, they sailed over the continental shelf. I don't have that there. And proceeded on an easterly heading. And this witness, his watch on deck started at 8 p.m, 2000 hours, of course, and after falling in by the starboard sea boat, he was detailed 2 hours wheelhouse, and which would have looked something like this at the time, where he had to work in there. And it was always a requirement to relieve 15 minutes early. But when he reached the wheelhouse, which was situated 2 decks below the bridge superstructure, which this is all the superstructure up here, you got the bridge down here, he received the heading on Megaro strip and his telegraph rating, and the engine position was told, half ahead, and the engine revs, and thereby relayed to the bridge, the relevant heading and the engine revs. And I have to say, by the way, that I've noticed with the cases by the military and people in aviation, and the police too, they're extremely detailed reports. They're so rich and chock full of details. Anyway, about 3/4 of an hour into the watch, the first of a series of frantic calls came down from the bridge, and he was given a southeast heading, increased telegraphs to full ahead, and the revs increased dramatically until they were at a top speed of 38 to 40 knots. And I think that's about 74 kph. Anyway, the ship stayed on that heading and speed for about 10 minutes, altering headings only slightly. And then he was given the command 20 degrees of port wheel. So the ship lurched and it rolled in the slight northeast swell, and then they had more confusion. They were then given reduced revs and then engine half ahead and all these different directions, and they resumed their old heading, and they stayed on that until the end of their watch at 21:45, 9:45 p.m. Anyway, they all sort of mustered back at the starboard sea boat with a lot of questions about what the heck had just happened, because the ship had been told to do this, do that, do this and do that. They didn't really know what was going on. Anyway, they were told by their fellow shipmates that the ship had been sent to cruising stations prior to 8 p.m. The sonar operators being closed up, they located a large ping on the sonar about the time they got the new heading and speed change. Now, the bridge, thinking it was the British submarine they were supposed to be accompanying, they chased it. But the sonar blimp got quite big, and it was estimated over 100 meters long, which is pretty long for something that's submerged in the water. and then it increased speed. And they were at about 40 knots, and the blimp's speed continued increasing. And finally, it disappeared at some incredible speed, while the sonar operators estimated in the hundreds of knots that ended the chase. Now, that's very fast. So the whole ship's company were agog, and soon after, the first lieutenant's voice came through the intercom, reminding them of their sworn oath not to communicate with the media regarding any of the night's events. So, you know, there's a cover up for you for sure. So the next case happened at the Nowra Air Base, and pre-dawn until 8 p.m, as it says there. So the witness who told us this account, he spoke at our conference in 2003. He bravely came forward and told of his experience, which he wasn't supposed to do. He had sworn an oath of secrecy and all that sort of stuff. So, but in the end, he said, "Oh, by God, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it." So he did, which was really great. Anyway, he was an ex-naval aircraft fitter based at the Nowra Air Base during the 1970s, when Australia still operated its A4 Skyhawk jet aircraft. And I think I've got a picture on it. That's the next one. Anyway, he was preparing Skyhawk fighter bombers for a dawn sortie at the HMAS Albatross on the day. And he was doing pre-flight inspections on the flight line with other 805 724 squadron personnel, when their attention was drawn by flying objects entering airspace over the bushland southeast of the base. And there were about 6 objects that were flying at a rapid speed in an easterly direction at near supersonic speed, but there was no boom that was noticed. The objects appeared to be teardrop in shape most of the time, but would change shape and were reflecting the first rays of the sun brightly from their unpainted metal surfaces. And they were completely silent. Their appearance was strange, but their activities really astounded the men who were there. And although the objects were several kilometres away, they were observed swooping down at above treetop level, then up again to return from the area of the Princess Highway and headed west out of sight. Now, the witnesses asked each other if they really saw what they saw, but the objects soon returned and did similar manoeuvres for about 10 minutes. So I'm putting myself there in their place. They've seen these objects in the sky. They've all sort of looked at each other and said, you know, did you see what I saw? Are we seeing things? I mean, I could just imagine what was going through their mind. But anyway, the objects returned, but the witnesses continued to work and observe the objects at intervals. And they noticed that they slowed down to helicopter speed in a wheel formation and slowly rotated around Pigeon House Mountain, which is the mountain here, which is it's a meso-like formation. It's about 14 kilometres south of them and just inland from Bateman's Bay, for anyone who knows that area. Now, as their pilots arrived, the UFOs broke formation and randomly shot high into the atmosphere, then returned in an erratic manner, like a falling leaf effect. And we've heard that many times before in years gone by, that this falling leaf effect of UFOs as they, come down, often usually coming down from high above. They also changed direction without slowing down, with force that was described as impossible to survive. They told the Skyhawk pilots that had company up there that day, and one replied, "Oh, God, not again," except there was a few more expletives than "oh, God." But anyway, they busied themselves to launch the fighters, but by the time they returned to the line shack, the UFOs had disappeared and left the area. Which I think I've got, there's the fighters there. And the reporting witnesses estimated they observed the UFOs for 45 minutes to an hour. So that's a heck of a long time to be seeing these objects while they're doing what they had to do. They knew that no other aircraft from their base had taken off on that day. And they also knew that they were not Australian military aircraft. And the nearest RAAF base was Fairburn in Canberra. And that was about 200 kilometres away. And that was a base mainly used for VIP aircraft. Now, even though aircraft activity of this sort would have compelled any one of them to report possible attacking aircraft to the airfield tower, to his knowledge, this witness said no one ever did. And it was discussed amongst the ground personnel during the day, and the lack of cameras was obviously lamented, but the subject wasn't brought up until the Bateman's Bay reports 2 days later of strange lights and people in bush shacks being besieged by strangers, noises, and bright lights. And it was apparent that the objects had been active for most of the previous night, and they had only witnessed the tail end of the activity. And then a newspaper article appeared in the local paper about strange overnight activities inland from Bateman's Bay only 2 days later. So he didn't report the incident because he left the Navy in 1977 to join the police force and thought that such information might jeopardise his career. But he did eventually come forward in 2003 and reported it to our organisation. So there's a few things in that one. And when the ground crew were telling the pilots that, you know, you're going to have company up there, and one of the pilots said, oh, you know, not again. So obviously there'd been a bit of a history, I don't know how long, but the pilots were seeing UFOs in that area. And also soon after they'd reported that particular incident, this is, you know, people are being on the ground nearby were being besieged by strangers, noises and bright lights. Now, what those strangers were, we can only guess. You know, we don't really know what that might have been. But I think that's a very interesting case. Now, this one involved a senior policeman, and it's quite lengthy, like I said before. It occurred out at Yower. He and his brother, which is obviously is over here with the little red dot is. Oh, no, my cursor's not working. That's weird. There it is. So he and his brother lived in Canberra, somewhere in Canberra. He lived in Brisbane, and they had a mine out at Yower, and they used to go on their holidays, take their vacations out at the mine, and they'd meet up and spend time together and do what they loved to do. This particular policeman was a senior police officer who was involved in TAS at the time, which was the Traffic Accident Appreciation Squad. And these types, the people in this squad would see terrible things. They'd be called out to locations where, you know, people would have put a rifle in their mouth and shot their, you know, blown their head off, or they'd go out to, you know, fatal accidents where body parts are all over the place. It was a special squad that would go and deal with those particular cases. So when all these experiences started to happen to him, he said to us, you know, he said, I started to wonder whether it was the stress of the job, and I was having all these experiences due to stress. But actually, in many of the cases, it was corroborated by his brother, which was very interesting. But anyway, so this was out at Yower, where the mine was an opal field. And on somewhere between the 21st and the 30th of November in 1988, they were out there, and they usually spent their time working the mine that they had from 5 p.m. to 5 or 6 a.m. the next day, working in the cool of the night to save the equipment from getting overheated, because it was obviously very hot down in a mine too. So they wanted to make sure the machinery could withstand the heat. Anyway, they were mining at a depth of approximately 50 feet, mining off that shaft horizontally about 12 feet per day. So they've got this deep 50-foot shaft, and then they'd go horizontally. They'd mine out from that in different directions. Anyway, so Larry, the main witness, he was using the jackhammer and his brother was using the shovel, but suddenly all their equipment cut out. And that included a 100 CFM compressor motor and a motor on a hoist which ran their 12-volt lighting system so they could see what they were doing. Previously, they'd never had motors cut out at the same time, and they were quite quizzed and nonplussed about it. They had a discussion about the situation, thought it was too soon for both motors to run out of petrol or need oil or anything like that. But they decided that John, Larry's brother, would go up the ladder and have a look at the motors, and what might have caused them to cut out, and wondering among many other ideas that someone might have turned off the motors to call Larry, who often would provide first aid for people in the area. Anyway, John moved to the bottom of the shaft and he called out if anyone up top was there, but no one answered. So he yelled back to Larry that no one answered. So John went up to the top of the ladder to investigate. Meanwhile, Larry sort of moved out to the bottom of the shaft, sitting on the drum, and sat there to cool off as he was perspiring excessively, as you can imagine in that sort of situation. But in the next moment, he realised that he'd completely dried off and was feeling like abnormal temperature, which is very strange. But anyway, all of a sudden he had a feeling. Now, this is his own words. He said, a feeling that he had two brains, and one of them was from below his rib cage to about halfway down his thighs. And with this brain, or whatever it was he was sensing, he reported receiving pictures of naked women, and some of them were pornographic. And he remained very calm and thought, how mind-boggling is this? This is happening. And while he was thinking that, he passed out. His next recollection was a floating feeling like he was moving along the drive, and he knew that he had beings with him and that they weren't human. He also knew he had a sperm sample taken, and perhaps maybe that was why he was having these pornographic images shown in his mind. Anyway, his next recollection is of his brother moving towards the top of the ladder, now halfway up and out of the mine, with Larry following immediately behind him with his head near John's feet. And Larry kept climbing the ladder. And as his brother climbed out, Larry told his brother that he was feeling quite dizzy. And he asked his brother, how was it that they were emerging from this mine in sunlight when normally it was dark? And also, Larry had no actual recollection of climbing the ladder. He had an overwhelming feeling then that the sun should have been behind them in the west, but the sun wasn't there either. He said, I can't see the sun. Where's the sun? And at that stage, he started to feel a bit panicky. And he wasn't making any sense at all. So because he was seeming like it wasn't making any sense, his brothers had a few severe words to him and told him that it didn't matter and get out of the hole. Anyway, Larry climbed out. He felt dizzy for a moment, so he held onto the rail. And as he emerged from the hole, the sun suddenly appeared, as it would at sunrise. And Larry was hit by the sun's rays and held on to the framework of the hoist for a moment or two. Anyway, the next thing, his head became completely clear. Feeling fully oriented, he lost the sense of panic and became calm. Anyway, the two men had a discussion about what had occurred, wondering about the possibility of some sort of strange magnetic field having passed through the earth, disturbing their thinking patterns. They were really trying to make sense of what had actually just happened. Anyway, at this time, Larry noticed that his watch had stopped right on 4 o'clock. And John looked at his watch and discovered it had stopped at the same time. And Larry's watch was a wind-up mechanical watch and John's was electronic, but both watches stopped at exactly the same time. So they decided to check the time on the radio, and as daylight saving was in operation, they made sure they found a Queensland radio station, which was the time they had their watches set to. And when they did, they discovered they'd lost exactly 1 hour of time. And when Larry and John went down the mine to check how much work they'd done, they discovered they'd dug only 3 feet, which was a quarter of what they normally would have done. And they were both freaked out, basically, by their discovery, but decided it was just something simple, something strange that had happened, like magnetism, and they were all disoriented. They couldn't really explain it. But, they decided it was no use worrying about it. It wasn't going to achieve anything, so they just forgot about it, put it out of their mind. But 6 months later, Larry and John were again at their mine and staying in a cabin at their friend's caravan park. And one of them woke up to go to the toilet, and as they'd been told, there was a very large brown snake moving around the toilet area, which was behaving aggressively to some of the other people in the park. They decided that they should both go to provide safety in numbers. So the brothers walked to the toilets and Larry went in and out before his brother. And when he came out, Larry walked 5 paces from the door. And as he did so, he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye, which was also seemed to be right above him to the right. And at the same time, a shadow passed over him from behind and then going straight ahead. Now, Larry could see the left-hand edge of the shadow, which was curved around to his right, as though whatever was making it circular was curved for some distance. He observed the leading edge of the shadow pass across the ground and up the wall of some units and across and over the roof. And the moment he caught out of the corner of his eye was up in the sky, the movement, and in the direction of the moon. So he looked towards the moon. He saw something circular with a steely metallic glow to the left of the moon. And this is his sketch here. And all in all, over time, and I'll make this a bit short because I don't want to run out of too much time, but while he was watching it, this object sort of tilted on its side and moved away from him, this larger object, which he managed to work out was 230 meters in diameter. So we're talking huge, some huge UFO that was silent, moving slowly and low overhead. But as he was watching it sort of move off, there were 3 of these little objects that appeared, and they got a little bit bigger, and they were shaped similar to this larger one with this sort of skirt that went out and down at an angle. And then another 3 appeared. So there were, I think there ended up being 8 in total, and which was very strange. And they just kept watching it. Anyway, so while that's all happening, Larry's calling out to his brother, get out here, I'm seeing a UFO. Of course, his brother thinks he's not telling the truth. He says he's lying, and Larry says, no, I'm not lying, get out here. So his brother manages to get outside, and he sees it, but further off in the distance as it's disappearing. So they ran to tell their friends nearby, who were staying in a caravan, I think it was. But by the time they came out, the friends came outside, the objects had streaked off. One of the friends actually managed to see something just leaving before it streaked off. But after that particular incident, a lot of strange sort of things begin to happen to Larry. And he began having visions where he would see a sort of a screen appearing. Whoops, someone fell off and they're coming back in. Where are we? Okay. Oh, stop sharing. What screen sharing? What happened there? Anyway, so he started to have these strange visions where he'd see this sort of TV screen, and it would appear sitting up in the air ahead of him, and there'd be moving pictures on it. So to give you an example, on one occasion, now this is going to 29th of June in 1989. It was prior to 6 a.m. and he was driving to work, and a screen suddenly appeared in front of him. And on the lower left-hand corner, there was an image of the large craft, and he had a very strong feeling that he had to look at it very closely and notice something particular about it, but he couldn't see anything particular about it. But this went on for as long as he drove for 300 meters, and then it just disappeared. Anyway, he had 3 more visions, strange sort of visions, and I'm just going to go ahead. This is one that he had. And in the vision, he saw this object that was coming down from above, sort of a shaft with these diamond shapes on it, and this sort of teardrop coming down into this blackened area. And these little white things that you can see here are shafts of light that were sort of surrounding the whole thing. So that was one thing that he could see. The next vision, he told his wife about this, and as soon as it finished, he told his wife another vision appeared. Now he's awake, right? He's awake and he's having these visions. And the second vision was that he was sitting in an object that was underneath a curved surface, much like the bottom of a large craft that he'd seen previously. The third vision was he was walking straight towards a very big arch, and I think I've got another sketch here. Yep, there was just an arch off to the side here. That's in 1992 is the sketch. It was about 100 feet in height. The background was in semi-darkness, but the light increased as he walked towards it, so he could see the arch was totally engraved with a vine of some sort. And he goes into great lengths, giving all the details about the vine, the arch, etc. But when Larry walked up to the first archway, a very big face appeared on the arch with an unhappy-looking face with a beard. And the face seemed wrinkled to some degree as though weathered, and he was wearing a hood. Now, these hooded beings often show up with people's close encounter experiences. Anyway, this face, it actually turned out to be on a sort of big glass screen, and demanded to know what Larry was doing there. But there was a being with Larry and basically said that he has permission to be here and I'm with him and it's all okay. There's much more to that, which I don't have the time to go into, but these are the types of visions that he was having. But anyway, on another occasion, I'll just finish off with this. On the 4th of October, 1989, back at the camping ground near their mine, a friend of Larry and John invited them to have tea with his family, and it was a pleasant evening. They left at midnight. They got to bed 10 minutes later. But at some point between going to bed and 1:49 a.m., Larry woke up with the feeling that someone was in the room. He had a flash of worry that someone was trying to steal something. And you've got to remember in these particular sort of situations where people go gold mining, opal mining, all these sorts of things, that there's a lot of theft, okay? And I've got a relative who goes gold fossicking down in South Australia, and he carries a gun and a knife with him because there are people who will come and they will steal what they've gathered. So everyone who sits around the campfire night always has some sort of weapon around them. So it just gives you an idea. So anyway, so this is what he woke up with. He thought someone's trying to get in here and steal something from us. But he had that feeling, but it was immediately overtaken with feelings of love and extreme happiness. And he knew that whoever was in the room was a friend and a very dear friend that he'd not seen for some time. Now, this is very interesting in itself. I always take notice of these types of things because I feel that, people's fears are allayed by these beings for whatever reason. We don't really know why, but in many cases. But he rolled over and looked towards his brother's bed, and he could see a luminous white misty figure, and it was thick, about 9 inches in thickness, and leaning forward over his brother's head and shoulders. And Larry smelt a smell that he'd never smelt before or since that time. It wasn't an unpleasant smell, but the atmosphere had become very heavy and swirly and black, except for this entity that had now appeared in their room. It had the moonlight was stifled, and all they could see was the entity. And at this stage, Larry said the word Minotaur, which his brother told him later. Larry didn't even know he'd said this. Later, John told Larry that he also said, "Oh, our friends are back from outer space. Isn't it fantastic?" And apparently he repeated this several times. And he then had a conversation with this being, which sometimes spoke to him through his brother, which is very interesting in itself. So at one stage, the entity took 2 paces towards Larry, and he could see it had a very angular, thin, very insect-like shape to its head, and he could see that it had no head, no hands, and no feet. But these areas of the body ended in a faint mist, and where the shoulders were reaching 6.5 feet from the ground. So it was like this entity didn't want these parts of its body to be seen. And, Larry was told that by this being that they actually look like praying mantis. And we heard a lot of these reports in the 90s that people were talking about mantis beings. And that's why it didn't want to show themselves fully. And he was told that this entity had a similar role to our police force, which was to keep peace in space. Anyway, Larry told the entity to reveal himself. And as soon as he said the word reveal, the entity's right eye appeared, and it was above the shoulder, and it was up about 7.5 feet high, and the eye was teardrop in shape. The entity made a light appear from the wall, and that's when Larry could see he was wearing a spacesuit. And I think I've got that here. This is his sketch. It seemed to be a moulded, seamless pattern with padding above and below the knees. And the entity then left, walking through the concrete wall. So there's a lot to this story. There's a lot more that goes on in it. Like I said, it was very well documented by my husband, Martin, and 2 other colleagues at the time. It didn't actually get published before Larry actually passed away a couple of years ago, which was a shame. But it's very detailed and highly complex. So that's the 3 cases that I had to talk about.
I was interested in the drawing of the almost like a hat, like a almost, you know, the craft with the little ones around it, because back in I think it was 86 in New Zealand, there was a sighting at a remote beach in Northland, and there were 2 guys camping, and one of them went down to the beach to collect some wood and just have a look around, and while the other one was doing things in a campground, and he saw what he thought was some helicopters hovering over perhaps a boat or a ship way out at sea. And he watched it for a while, and then he saw it rise out of the water, and it had that same squarish top. A huge craft came up out of the water, and the what he thought were helicopters were small craft circling around it, and then it came up and gone, little ones gone too. So I was quite interested to see that looking so similar.
And like I said before, and I'm sure you guys would agree, that with the police, pilots, or people in the aviation industry and the military, you know, they dot their I's, they cross their T's, and they like to capture every single detail that they can. He was this particular man, you know, that's why the manuscript is just so huge, because it was all recorded, then it was transcribed, and he would, you know, he described the length of the leaves on the vines on this archway, and it's just, you know, just amazing stuff, which, you know, if I think that other people may not describe it in such detail, put it that way.
Was the mine shaft their first experience?
Yes.
That's a really unusual place to have such an encounter, isn't it? It shows they can get you anywhere.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's out of the way. And actually, there was a gentleman years ago called Bruce Cummings. He's since passed away too. He was Lightning Ridge UFO Watch, and we were often in communication with him. And Bruce was out at Lightning Ridge when there was opal fields. He used to cut opals, and there are a lot of people out there in this remote place where they would also report very rich, intricate experiences. You know, particularly in one case I remember was where a UFO had landed, it opened, and people saw beings come out of it, and you know, and that was full of rich detail too. And Bruce collected all of those. So yeah, it's Australia's a big place, and it has a lot of remote areas, and there's a lot going on in the outback that we will probably never know. Over the years, a few Aboriginal people have called in and told these sorts of stories and said, mate, you have no idea what's going on out here, you know, these sorts of things. So, yeah, it's huge. And we may never know.
That's interesting, Sheryl, because I was sitting there quite mesmerised by the size of the map, you know, the size of your country compared to ours. But we also have those remote areas where all sorts of strange things happen, and sightings and underground sounds and, you know, accompanying a spate of sightings. So it's really interesting. I think if they wanted to hide out on the planet, that it's a good place in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
Very isolated indeed.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's things still happening out at Lightning Ridge out there, or it's a little bit flat based like we tend to see.
Yeah, it could be, quiet like it's gone in most places. In Australia.
I'd be interested to know some of your bases if they coincide with the Bruce Cathy grid lines, because we noticed that wherever our bases are in New Zealand, they're very right on the grid lines, which is quite unusual, but maybe someone knows something that the general public doesn't. And the Waihopai Valley, which is where the American spy base is in Blenheim in the South Island, there's been numerous sightings up there, and the people who live up there are sheep station owners. They've got massive areas of land farming sheep, and it's quite remote, but that's where they've put this base with these great big huge white domes, and that are covered so you can't see them, and you're not allowed near the area, and you're prosecuted if you enter the area, similar to your bases. And but one of the farmers' wives up the top of the valley was taking her daughter to sports in Christchurch, which is quite a considerable drive, a long drive, and they were followed down the valley by a UFO that would just like go around the corner and be waiting for them behind the hill. When they went round, there it was, and it went on with them a bit further. At the moment, her daughter showed extreme fear and couldn't take it any longer, and the woman decided that at the next farm gate she was going to go up the drive and not carry on down the valley. As soon as they felt that extreme fear, it just moved away quietly and disappeared. So there's a lot that happen in these valleys where these things are. We had similar sighting up in the Dome Valley north of Auckland, and again we've got another spy station up there, and it was just 5 kilometres away, and there's a lot of sightings and strange activity around there. Why, I don't know, but that's certainly how it's reported.
I wanted to ask you too if you've had cases where people have reported having these visions of these screens and images appearing, because his case reminds me a lot of, and I may be wrong, going back into 1954 or something like that, of the Orfeo Angelucci case. And he spoke about objects coming up, one on each side in front of him, and then between them they projected a screen, and on the screen were beings who communicated with Orfeo.
Well, I've seen those screens myself just appear in front of me, and on one occasion I woke up and opened my eyes, and it was as if there was a screen hanging right above me, and I was looking at a grey and he was looking back at me, and there was this, it was almost as like his facial expression didn't move because they're very bland, but I could sense he went like that, and the screen disappeared. So I wasn't meant to see that. Why that was, I don't know, but I have seen those screens appear at other times as well in a room, and I'm showing something. And I know a lot of other people talk about the same sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's another case that I recorded where a woman had a screen appeared in front of her. She was actually lying in bed. She was awake. A screen appeared, but she could see in the screen a human in a white lab coat, and he was wearing glasses, and he was looking at her, which is very unusual. I don't know what that was. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had screens sort of appear myself as well, but not quite in the same, in sort of the same ET sort of context. I've sort of had, it usually happens when you're like sort of extremely tired but not asleep. A screen sort of appears almost like a third eye position here, and visions of people's faces that you haven't seen before, or a scene from another time. Like I've had that before. I've had almost like it's a screen. It's definitely a flat 3-dimensional screen, and it could be sort of like what you'd perceive to be the Southampton docks or something like that in the 19th century. So I've had those sort of experiences myself, and they're quite detailed, and they're quite real.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And I also just want to talk about UFOs that they do seem to know where you're going. Like that's happened I've got two great cases down here that happened exactly like that, where basically people are driving along in cars, UFOs are tracking alongside, flying off ahead, waiting for them in other predetermined points that you'd say, well, how did it know that we were heading out to that area? You know, and even take off outright and then get to that area, and then sure enough, there it is hovering, waiting for them.
Yeah. And actually, I spoke about a case like that, which Jeff would know about, which is Rita Hayden from Ipswich, because Rita had that experience too in the early hours of the morning. I spoke about this at the Cardwell UFO Festival recently. I zoomed into that, and Rita was, you know, she was driving home. UFO pulls up. She sees the light off in the distance. She pulls up. It pulls up beside her. She said, I could touch it if I put my hand outside the window. You know, it was silver. It was sleek. Had a light at the rear end. Anyway, the lights change where she's pulled up at a red light. It takes off, but she then drives on and gets to the top of her street and sees that it's hovering over her neighbour's garage. And then she gets up the gumption to actually drive in, get out of the house. And when she gets inside the house, it moves from the neighbour's garage over her own backyard. And then it stays there for an hour, lights up the place like daylight. She's on the phone to us all the time while it's happening, once she actually gets inside. And then it takes off. And the next day she finds a foot of water disappears from her pool. The little dog, neighbour's dog that was barking, loses the hair over a month and dies. And a large big mango tree she had in the backyard also dies too. So
even in the Nimitz encounter, they had that experience where the Tic Tac was flying out to their predetermined point.
Yep.
Which was highly classified information, and you sit there and you go, well, the US military is reporting exactly the same behaviour in their most candid encounter that's come out to us.
So how do they know?
Well, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? You know, it's mind reading at its simplest. You know, they have the ability to read our minds. They, you know, is it a time space thing? Like they can see time space. They know where you're heading to on that sort of level. A combination of perhaps all those things.
Yeah,
they're just questions.
Well, it's like the Malmstrom Air Force Base in the States with Robert Salas. They somehow knew that at that moment they were going to be testing the Minuteman missiles. And just as the missiles were coming up out of the ground and rising up like this, in came the UFO, swooped in, shut them down, shut down all the computers, and took them 2.5 days to get them back up and running.
China's been building more missile silos out in their western provinces. I think they've been out there peppering them out there, and part of me sort of goes, well, I'm not that worried about it, because you know, maybe the UFOs will step in and prevent any of those sort of launches, as we've seen all throughout the Cold War, and tests in America as well. Maybe we'll see that in the future that these types of incidences will occur again.
In New Zealand, we now know with the release of the files that there were Americans who'd come to New Zealand at the time just after the Kaikoura Lights sightings, really encouraging New Zealand, the government, etc., to shut it down. They didn't want it publicly put out there. We know that there was an actual committee of politicians and other scientists, etc., in New Zealand who were investigating it. They put together a group, but it kind of fizzled out after a while, or it kept going for a while privately, we don't know. But we've also had a witness come forward who's the daughter of a very high-ranking person in aviation in New Zealand, who's come to us with her story about what took place with American representatives of the military, etc., or whatever group they belong to, coming to New Zealand around that time. So, and that was all hushed, and pretty much the whole sighting the series of sightings were basically crucified in the newspaper and by the government, basically saying that it was Venus, or it was city lights reflected off flocks of birds and all that kind of thing. Totally ridiculous. It's all right. They also tried to defame my colleague in UFOCUS NZ, who's 89 now, John Cordy, who was the last air traffic controller, is the last air traffic controller from that time, who was a very, very particular person and very responsible air traffic controller. And they tried to say that the radar was faulty, and it wasn't. So all of these things we believe, were orchestrated, A, by a military in New Zealand that didn't know how to handle the situation, and B, by American representatives who came and told them what they should do. Mm-hmm. Well, they sent in, I think TVNZ or TV1 sent people into, and the government sent people into the studios to take all the footage. So it was all cleaned out, just disappeared, that had been taken by news crews in New Zealand. Because we're not talking just about the 2 Kaikoura light sightings, we're talking about hundreds of sightings that the public made and pilots made. So that was all removed, but the 2 cameramen who had been at the Clarence River mouth near Kaikoura filming at night still had the footage in the camera, the old cassettes in the camera, and they hid the camera. And they took the cassette home, which they shouldn't have done, but they did, and they kept it for decades. And when we held our conference in New Zealand and Graham went public about his sighting, etc., and the fact that he was working with our group, then we were contacted by one of the cameramen. The older gentleman had died, and the younger one, now older, said, I've still got the footage. I assisted him in finding a studio that would transfer it, digitize it, because it was 16 millimeter. And he promised to give us copies, and it was going to be made public, because he felt he had captured the moment where they saw a big light that split in 2, and the 2 bits went off. I've seen that myself. And he believed he'd captured it. And sure enough, he took it to the studio to be digitized. There it was on film. Within minutes of the people at the studio seeing it, someone must have gone and made a phone call somewhere, because within a short time, he got an offer of a large sum of money for it from the States, from supposedly a documentary company. He accepted it, he sold it, so we lost that piece of our history that could have put this whole argument about the Kaikoura lights to bed for good. And it was sold. It's never appeared in a documentary. It's just disappeared into a black hole, never to be seen again. So yeah, very distressing when you're so close and boom, it's gone.
Yeah, and I think one of Australia's best military response cases is the one that's getting a lot of attention at the moment, is the Westall schoolyard encounter of 1966. The military responded to that in a very, very quick fashion. They had a very iron-fisted approach to it in regards to how the children and the staff were handled at that time. They were at the location very quickly on that particular day, and there were men in blue uniform. The thing that hasn't ever really been determined is who was actually there and where did they actually come from. There's still no real clear answer on that, on who actually responded to Westall in such a quick fashion in 1966 when the Vietnam War was starting to rage. They had military in Melbourne that could get there with trucks. They went in there and they basically stamped out the circles, burnt the ground, did whatever they had to do to eradicate that. So therefore you say, well, what was it that came down? And that debate has raged around Westall as well. Was it a balloon? Was it another military project and it had gotten away on them and they'd tracked it all the way in? Or was it, as most people tend to believe, it actually an ET answer? But they got there in lightning speed. The whole thing was shut down. Clips didn't air that were taken by the news crews. All those clips have disappeared since. It's probably the best example in Australia of that iron fist coming down and stamping something out. That if it had occurred today with all the mobile phones that the kids have got now, it'd be incredibly hard to put Westall to bed. But back in 1966, it was a lot different. I'd just like to share before I finish that recently we had our first cattle mutilation case come in, and in 10 years of doing UFO research, I've not had a cattle mutilation case. And the other day, a gentleman contacted me from northeast Victoria, and he'd been out walking on his neighbour's property, and he came across this cow that was by itself in a really distant paddock. And when he walked around the cow, he saw that the cow had its mouth had been cut out, and it's been like sharply cut out. It's not like it's been attacked by dogs or rats or foxes. The udder was removed as well, and round the udder was a cut round the udder, and the bum area had also been clawed out as well. So that's presented a whole heap of complications for me. First of all, it wasn't his farm or his cow, and the owners were away. And he rang and told the owner, and the owner said has had two more cows like that on this particular property over time, which I thought, well, that's interesting. And being in lockdown, that also makes it really, really difficult. And it's also a mountain range away from here in the middle of snow season. So it's highly unlikely that I'm going to get over there. But I was really encouraged to have this report come through, and the gentleman was kind enough to send me some soil samples as well from around the cow and a control sample. So and in Victoria, like you don't hear a lot of mutilation cases, and this one's no more than 2 weeks old now.
That's very interesting, Ben, because I've just had a mutilation case in Argentina too, which one of the representatives in ICER is looking at.
Yeah, I'm happy to send you the photos. Like they, and a lot of local farmers said to him, no, it's just predators. The predators have just got to it, and that's that. And you look at these cuts, and you just go, it's just not serrated teeth that are pulling this off. And I think you'll tend to find also that it's a bit blackened around the mouth, and that predators don't go near these cows. These cows are left. Nothing really touches them after they've been through whatever they've been through.
Was all the blood drained, Ben?
Yes, all the blood was drained, and not a drop of blood anywhere. No entrails. The cow's just as clean as anything, and it's just it's a typical. If you've studied cattle mutilation, it's 100% ticks all the boxes of a classic mutilation.
And there's no the photos you sent me don't show any sign of struggle around the animal either.
No, it hasn't been kicking or thrashing or anything like that. So it's and this is sort of in the Benalla area, which is sort of just a bit closer to Melbourne from Wangaratta. So it's around that region where this is coming. So I thought that was very exciting.
So I've asked Ben to write that up for us and publish it so we can publish it in the next issue of UFO Encounters, so you'll be able to see the photos.
Yeah, we will do.
A couple of weeks ago, I had a guy from down Glenorchy, which is near Queenstown in the South Island, and he's has a small tourist operation, and he's a fitness guy, and he regularly climbs up this mountain that's down there around the lake, and it's got fantastic views. And while he was up there, he's also part of the voluntary emergency services in that area. And he saw what he thought must be, his mind was telling him it must be a helicopter coming down vertically. And it came down from a great height, it stopped, and then it sped up, and it sped up. He said it went really fast, just straight towards the ground vertically. And he said his heart was in his mouth because he thought, what on earth is going on? There's going to be a fiery explosion any second. And he said then he saw, as it slightly tilted, that it was actually a craft. It was not a helicopter, it was circular, and it went straight into the ground and disappeared. So I talked to him for about an hour and a half, and he just basically repeated it. He was really shocked about it, and told a few close friends in the area who poo-pooed him, and he had nowhere to go with it. So he began searching the net and found us, and just poured it all out, his absolute horror at seeing this happen and expecting that he would have to run down there and get to town and assist. And he was still in his own mind trying to convince him that it must have got close to the ground and then taken off, but he didn't see it take off. But then he'd say, but I know it went straight into the ground. It just disappeared. I'm trying to explain it away.
I've thought of another place in Victoria where they have strange rumblings, and it's down in the Latrobe Valley. And the Latrobe Valley is basically the power centre of Victoria. It's where there's large open cut mines, and the Loy Yang power station is an absolute monolith of power distribution across all of Victoria and even into South Australia, I think. And there's an area called the Haunted Hills, which is quite an appropriate name, which is out around Maui, and that's had a lot of strange happenings out there. People have reported deep sounds coming in that area. There's also ghost reports from out that part of the world. Even the cattle run around crazy in that area as well. So that's a fairly interesting area. And the Latrobe Valley area in general also attracts UFOs coming down. I've heard numerous reports over the years of UFOs coming out of the sky, coming down over the top of the power stations, the Yallourn North one, Loy Yang, the old Hazelwood. Workers there have got stories of things sitting in the sky watching what they're doing.
And we will see you again next month.